There are scams that steal a few $1,000s. There are scams that destroy companies. And then there are scams so audacious that even the biggest bank in America walks away asking the same question everyone else is asking. How did we not see this? In the fall of 2021, one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth agreed to spend $175 million on a fast-growing startup that promised access to millions of young customers. The deal looked brilliant. The founder was celebrated. Investors applauded. The press loved the story. And then one day, somebody pressed send on an email campaign, and everything began to fall apart. Because the people they thought they had just purchased did not answer. Many of them couldn't answer. According to investigators, millions of them had never existed at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. America has always loved stories about young entrepreneurs. There is something irresistible about the idea that a person with a laptop and a big idea can build a company worth millions. It is the modern version of the American dream. Start in a dorm room, solve a problem, raise money, and change the world. This story appeared to follow that script perfectly. At the center of it was a young founder we will call Emily Carter. She was intelligent, ambitious, and remarkably persuasive. She had attended elite schools, spoke confidently about fixing broken systems, and had become one of those people investors simply wanted to believe in. She wasn't selling luxury products or social media entertainment. She was trying to help students navigate financial aid applications, a complicated process that frustrates millions of American families every single year. For parents, college is one of the largest financial decisions they will ever make. For students, the paperwork can feel overwhelming. Emily's company promised something simple. It would make the process easier. It would help families understand financial aid and reduce the stress surrounding college costs. The idea sounded noble. It sounded useful. Most importantly, it sounded scalable. Investors saw a startup with enormous potential because every year millions of students enter the college system. If the company could reach even a small percentage of them, it could become a giant. As the company grew, Emily became a rising star in the technology world. She was invited to conferences. Journalists wanted interviews. Business publications celebrated her success. She was exactly the type of founder that investors and banks were searching for. Young, charismatic, and attached to a mission that sounded bigger than making money. By all appearances, everything was moving in one direction, up. But there was another reason the company had become attractive. A reason that had very little to do with financial aid forms. Banks spend billions of dollars trying to attract young customers. They know that a student with a checking account today could become a mortgage customer tomorrow. That same person might eventually need a credit card, a car loan, investment products, and retirement services. Young customers represent decades of future profits. They are incredibly valuable. This is where our second character enters the story. We will call him Richard Bennett. Richard wasn't one person. He represents the army of executives, bankers, analysts, and dealmakers searching for the next great acquisition. Inside one of America's largest banks, executives had become increasingly interested in reaching younger customers. Traditional banking wasn't enough anymore. Financial technology companies were changing the industry, and big banks didn't want to be left behind. Then they discovered Emily's company. On paper, it looked extraordinary. The startup claimed to have millions of users. Millions. Think about that for a moment. Building a customer base of that size takes years, sometimes decades. If those numbers were real, this wasn't just another startup. This was a company that had already solved one of the hardest problems in business: getting customers. Negotiations began. The conversations grew more serious. The numbers became larger. And eventually the possibility of a massive acquisition appeared. When companies are purchased, buyers perform something called due diligence. It is essentially an investigation. Lawyers review documents. Analysts examine financial statements. Consultants ask questions. Data is checked. Assumptions are challenged. At least, that is how it is supposed to work. According to later court filings and regulators, the bank repeatedly wanted information that could verify the startup's user base. The number of customers mattered because it was one of the company's most valuable assets. If millions of students had truly signed up, the acquisition made sense. If they hadn't, the entire deal looked very different. This is where the story takes a remarkable turn. According to prosecutors and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the startup had far fewer real users than claimed. Instead of more than 4 million customers, investigators later alleged there were fewer than 300,000. The difference wasn't small. It wasn't an accounting mistake. It was the difference between a successful startup and a company worth far less than its purchase price. But at the time, nobody outside a small group of people knew that. The acquisition moved forward. Contracts were signed. Congratulations were exchanged. The bank paid $175 million. And for a brief moment, everyone appeared to have won. Imagine the celebration. A young founder had sold her company for an amount of money that most people cannot even comprehend. Investors were rewarded. Bank executives believed they had secured millions of future customers. It looked like a perfect deal. Then came the emails. After the acquisition, the bank attempted to contact what it believed were hundreds of thousands of customers. This should have been routine. If you purchase a business with millions of users, reaching those users should be easy. Instead, something strange happened. The response rates were terrible. Even worse, according to legal filings, a massive number of emails bounced back entirely. Messages were being sent into the void. The customers the bank expected to find simply weren't there. At first, maybe it looked like a technical problem. Perhaps the data was outdated. Maybe there had been an error in the marketing campaign. But the questions kept coming. Where were the customers? Why weren't they responding? Why were so many email addresses invalid? Inside the bank, concern turned into suspicion. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the answers became. According to prosecutors, there had allegedly been efforts to create data that would make it appear as though millions of customers existed. Authorities would later claim that synthetic information had been generated to support the representations made during the acquisition process. What began as a celebrated startup success story was rapidly transforming into one of the most shocking fraud allegations in recent business history. The story exploded into public view. Headlines appeared everywhere. People asked the same question again and again. How could one of the biggest banks in the world be fooled? It's a fair question. Large institutions have armies of lawyers and analysts. They have resources that smaller companies could only dream of. Yet history is filled with examples of highly intelligent people making enormous mistakes. Sometimes the explanation is greed. Sometimes it is urgency. Sometimes it is the fear of missing out. Imagine sitting in a conference room and hearing that a startup has millions of young users. Imagine believing that your competitors might acquire that company if you don't act quickly. Imagine thinking you are looking at an opportunity that could transform your business for decades to come. People do unusual things when they believe they are about to miss something valuable. As more details emerged, the case became about far more than fake users. It became a story about trust, about ambition, about the power of a good narrative. Because Emily's story had all the ingredients people wanted to hear. A young founder solving a real problem, a rapidly growing startup, a mission that sounded meaningful, success arriving at exactly the right moment. And maybe that is what makes stories like this so fascinating. Fraud rarely arrives wearing a mask. It often arrives dressed as opportunity. It sounds reasonable. It looks impressive. It tells people exactly what they want to hear. Years after the deal, the allegations would lead to lawsuits, criminal charges, and courtroom battles. Prosecutors argued that the numbers had been inflated to persuade the bank to move forward with the acquisition. The founder denied wrongdoing and maintained that the bank knew far more than it later admitted. The legal fight became a battle over what was represented, what was verified, and who should have known the truth. But regardless of where someone stands on those arguments, one fact remains impossible to ignore. $175 million changed hands because millions of customers were believed to exist. And when the bank finally tried to reach those customers, it discovered that many of them were nowhere to be found. The story leaves us with an uncomfortable question. If one of the largest financial institutions on Earth can allegedly purchase millions of users who were never there, what does that say about the way modern business works? How many companies are valued on numbers nobody truly understands? How many investors are buying stories rather than facts? The more people learned about the case, the more unbelievable it seemed. Because this wasn't a tiny startup operating from a garage somewhere. This was a company that had attracted respected investors, earned glowing media coverage, and convinced one of the biggest banks in America to write a check for $175 million. If this could happen here, where else could it happen? And that question takes us to something even bigger than one startup and one acquisition. It takes us into the world of modern business itself, where companies are often valued less on what they are today and more on what people believe they could become tomorrow. In Silicon Valley, numbers can feel like magic. A startup with 10,000 users might be interesting. A startup with 100,000 users might attract investors. But a startup claiming millions of users can suddenly become a potential gold mine. It changes the conversations. It changes the headlines. It changes the valuation. More importantly, it changes the way people think. Because once a company reaches a certain size, people often assume somebody else has already verified everything. They assume the investors checked the numbers. They assume the lawyers asked the difficult questions. They assume the banks looked under every rock. And sometimes those assumptions become dangerous. History has shown us this again and again. There were investors who believed a blood testing startup had reinvented medicine. There were sophisticated funds that believed a cryptocurrency exchange was one of the safest places in finance. There were executives who believed office-sharing companies would change the future of work forever. The pattern keeps repeating because human beings are not just investing in businesses. They are investing in stories. And Emily's story was incredibly powerful. She wasn't promising luxury products or social media trends. She was promising to help students and families. Her mission felt meaningful. Her company appeared to be growing rapidly. Her success looked authentic. Every piece of the story fit perfectly together, which is often why stories become so persuasive. People rarely question information that confirms what they already want to believe. Imagine being a banker and seeing a startup with millions of young users. Imagine the opportunity. Millions of future checking accounts. Millions of potential credit cards. Millions of future mortgages and investment accounts. Those customers could remain with the bank for decades. Suddenly, $175 million might not seem expensive at all. In fact, it might seem like a bargain. But business history is filled with moments where intelligent people become convinced that they are looking at a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The fear of missing out can cloud judgment. Nobody wants to be the executive who passed on the next great company. Nobody wants to explain why they ignored an opportunity that later became worth billions. So the pressure to move quickly can become enormous. That is one of the reasons this case captured so much attention. It wasn't simply about fake users. It was about human psychology. It was about trust. It was about what happens when ambition meets optimism and difficult questions stop being asked. As the legal battle unfolded, investigators and lawyers spent years examining documents, emails, and data. Every new filing seemed to reveal another layer of complexity. There were allegations about customer information, allegations about how data had been created, and arguments over what was known and when it was known. The founder denied the allegations and argued that the bank had conducted extensive due diligence before agreeing to the acquisition. The bank, on the other hand, argued that it had been deceived. And perhaps that is why this story remains so fascinating. Both sides claimed they were the victims. One side said it had been misled into buying millions of customers that did not exist. The other suggested that the bank was suffering from buyer's remorse after realizing the acquisition had not gone according to plan. Somewhere inside those arguments lies a lesson that extends far beyond this one case. The lesson is that size does not guarantee safety. A large company can make mistakes. A celebrated founder can face serious allegations. A respected investor can be wrong. And a number written on a spreadsheet can sometimes be worth millions of dollars, even if nobody fully understands where it came from. Think about your own life for a moment. How often do we trust information simply because it appears official? How often do we assume that somebody else has already checked the facts? A headline appears online. A company reports impressive growth. An expert says something with confidence. And because the information looks credible, we rarely stop to question it. The entire modern economy depends on trust. Banks trust financial statements. Investors trust executives. Customers trust companies. Employees trust leadership. Remove that trust, and the system begins to shake. That is why fraud cases capture so much attention. They force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The systems we depend on are built on the assumption that most people are telling the truth. And when that assumption breaks, the consequences can be enormous. $175 million changed hands because people believed a story. They believed millions of customers existed. They believed the numbers represented reality. They believed they were buying access to an entire generation of young Americans. Instead, they found themselves at the center of one of the most talked about business scandals in recent memory. Years from now, people may forget the specific names involved in this case. They may forget the dates and the legal filings. But they will remember the central question because it is so difficult to ignore. How do millions of people disappear? How does one of the largest banks in America buy customers that it later claims were never there? And perhaps most importantly, how many other numbers in the business world exist simply because nobody has looked closely enough? The story also serves as a reminder that success can sometimes create its own momentum. Once a founder becomes successful, more opportunities appear. More investors become interested. More journalists write stories. More people assume the business must be legitimate because everyone else seems to believe in it. Success attracts trust, and trust can become incredibly powerful. But trust can also become dangerous, because every major financial scandal in history contains a similar moment. A moment when somebody should have asked another question. A moment when somebody should have looked a little deeper. A moment when the excitement of the opportunity became more important than verifying the facts. And perhaps that is the real reason this story resonates with so many people. Deep down, we understand that nobody is immune to being fooled. Intelligence doesn't make us immune. Experience doesn't make us immune. Wealth doesn't make us immune. Human beings are storytellers by nature, and when a story feels right, we often stop looking for reasons it could be wrong. The allegations surrounding this case will continue to be debated in courtrooms and legal filings. Lawyers will continue arguing over who knew what and when they knew it. But regardless of how those legal battles end, the story has already earned a permanent place in business history. Because somewhere inside a $175 million acquisition lies one of the simplest and most powerful lessons in finance. Always verify the numbers. Because sometimes the difference between success and disaster is nothing more than a spreadsheet filled with information that nobody questioned. There is an old saying on Wall Street that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Yet history has shown us that some of the smartest people in the world are capable of ignoring that warning. Entire fortunes have been built on optimism. Entire industries have been built on trust. And some of the biggest financial disasters in history happened because intelligent people convinced themselves that extraordinary claims must be true because everyone around them believed them. The story of the $175 million fake user scandal is one of those stories. Because the deeper you look into it, the less it feels like a simple fraud case, and the more it begins to look like a mirror reflecting the modern business world. A world where startups are often valued based on growth instead of profits. A world where investors chase the next big thing. A world where numbers can become more important than reality itself. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the environment in which it happened. The late 2010s and early 2020s were unlike anything the startup world had ever seen. Money was cheap. Investors were pouring billions of dollars into technology companies. Every week seemed to produce another unicorn, another founder, another revolutionary business that promised to change the world. Companies weren't just selling products anymore. They were selling visions of the future. And investors were willing to pay enormous amounts of money to own a piece of that future. Growth became the most important metric in business. How many users did you have? How fast were you growing? How large could you become? These questions mattered more than almost anything else. Because in the technology world, users are often seen as potential money. The more users a company has, the more valuable it becomes. At least, that's the theory. And that's exactly why the number at the center of this story mattered so much. 4.25 million. It sounds like just another statistic. But those 4 words represented everything. They represented future profits. They represented future customers. They represented future opportunities. To a major bank, millions of young customers weren't simply names on a spreadsheet. They were decades of future business. Think about it. A college student opens a checking account. A few years later, they get a credit card. Then they need a car loan. Then a mortgage. Then investment services. Then retirement planning. One customer can remain with a bank for an entire lifetime. Multiply that by millions of people, and suddenly $175 million starts to look like a bargain. And that's exactly why this deal moved forward. The opportunity appeared too good to ignore. But every great financial scandal contains a moment that only becomes obvious in hindsight. A moment when someone could have stopped everything. A moment when someone could have asked one more question. A moment that, years later, seems impossible to miss. For this story, that moment may have been the customer list itself. Because after the acquisition closed and the celebrations ended, reality began to enter the room. The bank started doing what any company would do after purchasing millions of customers. It tried to contact them. And that's when things became strange. Emails weren't being opened. Messages weren't being answered. Large numbers of email addresses reportedly bounced back entirely. Imagine being an executive and watching those reports arrive on your desk. At first, maybe you assume there's a technical problem. Maybe the campaign was poorly designed. Maybe the timing was wrong. But then the same thing keeps happening. Again, and again, and again. At some point, a very uncomfortable question starts to form. What if these people aren't real? It's difficult to imagine the silence that must have followed. Because if that question turned out to be true, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be catastrophic. $175 million had already changed hands. The acquisition was already complete. There was no easy way to undo what had happened. And so the investigation began. Lawyers started reviewing documents. Data experts began examining records. Executives started asking difficult questions. Every answer seemed to lead to another mystery. According to public allegations, investigators eventually concluded that the customer numbers were vastly inflated. Instead of millions of users, authorities claimed there were far fewer genuine customers. The difference wasn't minor. It wasn't a rounding error. It was enormous. And that is what transformed this story from a disappointing acquisition into one of the most remarkable business scandals of the decade. Because if the allegations were true, then one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world had just paid $175 million for something that largely didn't exist. That realization raises another question. How does something like this happen? How can highly educated people with unlimited resources fail to spot something so important? The answer is uncomfortable, because the answer isn't necessarily incompetence. The answer may simply be that human beings are incredibly good at believing things they want to believe. Psychologists have a term for this: confirmation bias. We naturally seek information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring information that challenges them. If we believe a company is successful, we focus on the evidence that confirms its success. If we believe a founder is brilliant, we become less likely to question their claims. If we believe an opportunity is extraordinary, we become less interested in hearing reasons why it might not be. This happens to ordinary people every day, and it happens to billion-dollar institutions too. History is full of examples. Investors believed blood testing machines could perform miracles. They believed cryptocurrency exchanges were safe. They believed office-sharing companies would transform the future. Again and again, intelligent people convinced themselves that extraordinary stories must be true. This case appears to fit into that long tradition, because the story itself was incredibly persuasive. A young founder, a mission to help students, rapid growth, millions of users, national recognition. Everything looked perfect, perhaps too perfect. There is another lesson hidden inside this story. Modern business often rewards growth more than accuracy. Companies are celebrated for growing quickly. Investors fear missing opportunities. Executives feel pressure to make transformative acquisitions. And when everyone is moving quickly, difficult questions sometimes get left behind. Imagine sitting in a boardroom and hearing that your competitors are also interested in the company. Imagine believing that if you wait too long, someone else will buy it. Imagine thinking that this acquisition could define your career. Suddenly, moving quickly starts to feel like the right decision. This is why some of the biggest mistakes in business happen during periods of excitement. Excitement changes the way people think. It creates urgency, and urgency can cloud judgment. That doesn't mean everyone involved acted recklessly. Far from it. Large acquisitions involve countless professionals: lawyers, bankers, consultants, analysts, all performing different roles. Yet despite all of those safeguards, mistakes still happen. And that may be the most fascinating part of this entire story. The fact that systems designed to prevent disaster can still fail. Because systems are ultimately built by human beings. And human beings are imperfect. They get excited. They become optimistic. They trust people. They assume others have already verified the information. And sometimes those assumptions lead to consequences that nobody expected. As the legal battle surrounding this case unfolded, Another debate began to emerge. Was the bank simply a victim? Or did it ignore warning signs because the opportunity seemed too attractive? It's a difficult question, one that probably doesn't have a simple answer. Because business decisions are rarely made in black and white. They happen in gray areas. People work with incomplete information. They make assumptions. They trust experts. They make judgments. Sometimes those judgments are correct. Sometimes they are disastrously wrong. This story also forces us to confront another uncomfortable truth. We live in a world where numbers carry tremendous power. A company says it has millions of users. An analyst says a market is worth billions. An executive projects enormous growth. And because the numbers are presented with confidence, we often accept them without question. But numbers are only as reliable as the people producing them. And once that trust disappears, everything changes. Investors become skeptical. Customers become nervous. Employees lose confidence. Entire companies can collapse. Trust is incredibly difficult to build and remarkably easy to destroy. And perhaps that is why this story resonates so deeply. Because it isn't really about one startup. It isn't really about one bank. It's about trust itself, the invisible force that allows the entire economy to function. Without trust, nobody would invest. Nobody would lend money. Nobody would sign contracts. Nobody would build businesses. Every transaction depends on the assumption that the information being presented is genuine. The moment that assumption is challenged, the entire system begins to shake. That is exactly what happened here. A simple question about customer numbers eventually became a national story. It led to lawsuits, investigations, criminal charges, years of legal battles, and endless discussions about how such a thing could happen. Yet perhaps the biggest lesson is surprisingly simple. Always ask another question. Always verify the numbers. Always remember that extraordinary opportunities deserve extraordinary scrutiny. Because history shows that some of the most expensive mistakes ever made began with a story that sounded perfect. And this story was certainly perfect. A young founder with a mission, a company helping students, millions of users, a $175 million acquisition. Everything looked like a success story until someone tried to send an email. And suddenly, millions of people seemed to disappear. Maybe that's why this case continues to capture so much attention. Because it reminds us that the difference between truth and fiction can sometimes be hidden inside a spreadsheet. It reminds us that even the most powerful institutions can make extraordinary mistakes. And it reminds us that in the world of business, numbers are powerful. But blind trust can be even more powerful. So let me leave you with one final question. If you had been sitting in that boardroom, looking at the same reports, hearing the same promises, watching everyone celebrate the deal, would you have raised your hand and asked one more question? Or would you have signed the papers too? If you enjoyed this documentary, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the bank was genuinely deceived? Or do you believe the warning signs were there all along? We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you're fascinated by stories of corporate scandals, financial disasters, and the incredible ways money and power shape our world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because the next story may be even more unbelievable than this one.